Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session, a live session of human rights and human wrongs. I'm very pleased to have with us our lead instructor, Joshua Castellino. And if you're wondering what the empty chair next to him is all about, it's because we have Professor Sarah Bradshaw joining us in a couple of minutes. She's on her way, but we didn't want to keep you all who joined us today waiting, so we decided to start. And we're going to touch on a lot of topics today. So we can definitely start with Joshua with us, and hopefully in a couple of minutes, Sarah will be here to join us. So welcome, Joshua, and thank you for being with us on this lovely afternoon for you. It's 4 p.m. in London, and it's 9:30 p.m. here in India. How are you doing today?
No, thank you, and hello to all. And I hope this slightly more reasonable time for people in Asia works better. So do let us know and give us feedback if the time is better suited now than it was earlier on. But thank you very much for hosting us, and I do hope Sarah will be here shortly.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, I'm still able to hear a slight echo to my voice, so I'm just wondering, I hope that nobody else is disturbed by that. If anybody is facing any sound trouble, please let us know in the little chat box that you have visible to you on the live link. Joshua, I'm going to start with a question that's actually coming for you, and this came specially for you in our discussion forum. We have Jennifer, who lives in Canada, and she's asked us this question. And forgive me, it's a long question, but these are her words, so I'm going to read as she's submitted it. She says that you spoke about autonomy in Module 4, Chapter 4. And in particular, looking at autonomous regions within territorial boundaries of states. And in Module 5, Chapter 2, you've discussed collective rights versus individual rights. And that chapter's reading, of course, discussed a declaration of the rights of indigenous peoples. Now, she says that the latter focuses on the right of self-determination to indigenous groups and the movement towards gaining territorial sovereignty of host nations in a form of a self-government. Now, does she say that, can you please comment on the conflicts that potentially arise when there are such autonomous self-governing regions that happen within these host nations? And what about the human rights of the people who raising this sort of creates a specter or a form of apartheid in itself? And do we allow for such separation of people, like smaller group separatism? Does that idea, does she say, does it not conflict with overall ideas of migration and diversity and acceptance of others? So she's saying that on one hand, we're talking about recognizing everybody as equal before law and affording everybody the same amount of equality in human rights. And then when we deem this special group and we want to give them territorial sovereignty, that also conflicts with the larger human rights regime that exists. And so what are your comments on this? I know that you've touched upon this before, but she's phrased this so nicely where she says that it seems to have a potential to run counter to the fight against discrimination, because on the basis of race, we are recognizing a smaller group just on that basis, whether it's race or ethnicity. And so she sees a problem in this larger framework.
Yeah, great question, Jennifer, and thank you for that question, Tetesri. First of all, the headline answer to this is absolutely there is a potential for division, no question about it. Let me give you some examples, and then let me go into the content of it. If you look at what's happening at this particular juncture in time in a state called Assam in India, this issue is absolutely live. So there is a challenge here. So the 1985 Assam Accords. Assam is a state in the northeast of India. Very close to Bangladesh. So there's an international boundary not far away. And essentially, there was a long civil war that took place there between what you would call an indigenous movement, the Assamese, and the Indian government at the time. It resulted in a peace process in 1985, the Assam Accords. And in those Assam Accords, one of the ways in which the Indian government sought to pacify the conflict was to guarantee that there would be meaningful autonomy in Assam. Now, meaningful, India is a federal system, so already there is autonomy. What was meaningful in that context? Meaningful in that context was really to guarantee to the Assamese indigenous peoples that they wouldn't have a lot of settlers in their midst who would, in inverted commas, weaken their Assamese culture, create all kinds of ways by which the Assamese language might become threatened. Now, is that discriminatory? Absolutely it is, because we are now saying indigenous peoples who live in Assam have a privileged access to rights that other people don't have. Is that justifiable? I think that's where the question begins. So your question immediately has salience if you would see the creation of an autonomous regime has disproportionate discrimination. So let's start off with the fact that autonomy creates discrimination already. And let's also start off with the fact that discrimination exists in all walks of life. Human rights law doesn't try to eliminate discrimination. Okay, it doesn't. It's very important to bear this in mind. Human rights law tries to eliminate unjust discrimination. So for instance, to give you an example, if I used to run 800 meters as a child and as a young adult. I can't now say to the state I'm living in, well, I used to run 800 meters. Why don't you pick me now to run in the Olympics? The state will say, well, because you're not fast enough. And I'll say, oh, that's discriminatory. You're discriminating against me because I'm not fast enough. And the state will say, yes, but in this context, the discrimination is justified because the test is about how fast you can run. So not all forms of discrimination are a problem. The discrimination becomes a problem when it's unfair or unjust. To Jennifer's question, absolutely, autonomy regimes can be unjust. They can unfairly give one group advantages over another group. I suspect you're thinking a little bit of the Nunavut situation in Canada, where Indigenous Canadians, Native Canadians, have a regime of autonomy which gives Indigenous Canadians the right to determine how governance will be set up in the autonomous state of Nunavut. That does privilege a particular group. Here comes Sarah. Welcome, Sarah. We're in the middle of talking about autonomy, so you have a few minutes to sit down and gather your thoughts. So essentially, in the context of Nunavut, what you are saying is you're privileging Native Canadians, giving them the right to govern their own affairs, and as a consequence of that, you are discriminating then against non-Native Canadians who may or may not wish to live in Nunavut. The story starts in that the argument for the justification of the autonomous regime is that the autonomous regime is necessary as a special measure to protect a group that is otherwise vulnerable. Will it create a discrimination against the majority? Yes. Is that discrimination justified? The jury is out on that because you need to test it. But the argument in the short term, certainly in terms of articulating why we need the measures, is that yes, they are necessary, because if you don't have an autonomous regime, this particular group that's far from sites of power in their own homeland, and that homeland bit is important, this particular group in their own homeland are essentially being treated as foreigners. They don't have access to power, they don't have access to sites of power, and as a consequence of this, they don't then have the means to be able to lift themselves out of the situation they face. But Indigenous autonomy is definitely less controversial than minority autonomy. Definitely less controversial. But you have minority autonomy regimes. Now, in international law, the typical way in which we think about autonomy is territorial autonomy. That means if a particular group is based in large numbers in one part of a city, state, region, you might say, well, why don't you govern yourself? And again, even when you create those autonomy regimes still have to be compatible with human rights law. That means you can't have discrimination, unjust discrimination. That means you have to pay attention to all the fruits of human rights. So you can't take autonomy as a way in which you can oppress different groups of people. So there are fine balances there. But I would encourage you, Jennifer, to also think beyond territorial autonomy to what is referred to in some jurisdictions, like in India and like in Malaysia and others, as personal autonomy. And that personal autonomy too can operate. But let's just agree with the headline to your question. Do autonomy regimes potentially defeat human rights? Answer yes. The key is to make sure there are enough checks and balances on autonomy regimes to make sure that they don't defeat human rights. Because as in of itself, autonomy regimes can be constructed that can discriminate against women by, first of all, ruling women out. You can say, oh, it's a cultural thing. In our culture, women don't have equal participation. So that autonomy regime can immediately have an impact on the gender question, which is also a great opportunity for me to invite Sarah to come and join us.
Sorry.
I trust that answered the question, Tadeshri. And Jennifer, please do get back if you want further clarification.
Thank you so much, Joshua, and welcome, Sarah. Welcome, lovely to have you here. And
Thank
I hope
you.
4:15 p.m. is good for you. I'm so sorry that you had trouble joining us, but we're so glad to have you here. And I was just speaking to Joshua in the context that this is the first week in the course that we're discussing gender, and so we've had some interesting topics on that as well. Circling back to your point, Joshua, on where you closed, I just thought that it's interesting. We're talking, I mean, in module 6 that we have, we're speaking about gendered equality and how in the larger economic regime, the reason why we need to factor gender in is because it per se doesn't exist. And I think there's in that context, there's something to be said that most countries in the world which have indigenous peoples, those indigenous peoples are very far removed from the normal legal regime, from the normal power regime. They have very remote access to the main economic schemes and processes that are supposed to be ordinarily deferred to their citizens. So we wouldn't be, the point is that we would be discussing a special regime of rights for them if rights as it normally exists in law was actually available to them. And so somewhere, exactly, somewhere that regime needs to be afforded to that. But Sarah, we've had some questions and some people commenting that it's now, we've reached a time or maybe a thing because of more recent awareness movements. I think some people were speaking specifically in the context of #MeToo. There's no need for households to factor in a gendered index or looking at gender as something that really needs to be reframed and revamped and sort of mainstreamed into the economic agenda. And I'm sure you have some comments or opinions on this. Can we sort of explain to people, or maybe maybe share that, women, while women may be more visible today, they're not really visible in the context of where their work, their output is at that. Do they feel that they're calculated in all the typical economic context? Why do we need to have such a strong voice that looks at gendered poverty, gendered sites, and gendered regimes, which obviously at some point were absent, and therefore there was a need to discuss this in a different context?
Okay, so first of all, sorry that I've arrived late and coming running down a road there to get here. So I apologise about that. In terms of why we still need gender and to be talking about gender in terms of economic regimes, I mean, one of the big issues is around, in the past, what the argument was around the fact we needed to include women or think about gender issues. But then as we've moved through, and in the 1970s, for example, if we're thinking about the global south, developing world context, then that was very much emerged in the 1970s. Through the 80s into the 90s, we found gender being very much taken on board in the global south in terms of policies, and in terms of the west, of course, more women moved into the workplace and took up more jobs and promotion and took up managerial roles and all the rest of that. So you might argue, well, we've been there, done that. And one of the issues we have now is the way that women are being included in the economy. If we're thinking about women as individuals, then of course we've got the idea that women might be involved in productive work, but then they're still undertaking reproductive tasks in the home, so they've still got unpaid care work in the home, plus their paid work. Plus, of course, across the globe, women still earn less than men for comparable jobs. Plus, of course, we've still got the glass ceiling, so we've got fewer women at the top of jobs, and we've got all that still needs to be addressed. So we can't just say, oh, well, we've achieved what we needed to achieve, because what we've often done, people argue, is we've created new burdens for women as they've moved through and taken on more high profile paid work. The unpaid paid work continues. And there was a study, I think it was from Australia, where it showed that as women earn more and more relative to their partners, their male partners, when they got to until a certain threshold, the male partner took over housework. But when the women earning a certain amount higher, then the women took back housework, so not to disempower their husbands. Because taking the idea of having to step back and having to resume that role in order to return to the traditional gender balance. So in that sense, I don't think we can say we've achieved what we need to achieve in terms of gender parity, because often what we've done is just put more work on women for a lower pay and for less status. And even if we look at the macro level, in terms of economies, we still don't have There's the women's budget group and gender budget groups across the globe. It says if we look at how money's spent, it's still not spent on those issues that are very important for women, such as unpaid care work, and women's issues are still not included in budgets. So to say, well, we've got there, we've done that, I think the problem we've got now is everybody's talking about gender, and the argument now becomes what type of gender we're talking about. And that's much more difficult to campaign on. Now, if you can just say, we want gender in, we want women in, that's one thing, but to say, oh, I know gender's there, but I don't like the way you've got gender in it, that's much more difficult. And I think that's where we're at the minute. Very much so. And of course, the issue around what we mean by gender and whether we're still talking about women is important to do because it reinforces binaries and gendered binaries. So we're into all that stage. But the very fundamental issue of have we got gender equality? No, we haven't.
Can I add 3 points to that? I think that's a very clearly articulated statement there from Sarah. I would add 3 things to it. One, the theory of affirmative action. The theory of affirmative action definitely suggests that you need to take measures until parity has been achieved. I think Sarah has demonstrated to you a number of reasons why parity has not been achieved. I mean, even when you look at, so even if you look at the terms being designed by a kind of male world, like access to finance, access to land, access to inheritance, this is not taking into account unpaid work. This is not taking into account material. So even the way, if you look at just existing factors that have been time-honed, you'll find women have not achieved that parity, have not been allowed to achieve the parity, I should say, rather than have not achieved the parity. So I think that's one reason why affirmative action measures have to continue. A second aspect to that also is that in the context of affirmative action measures, there will be exceptions when it's never possible to use an equality lens. For instance, the maternal function is always likely to be a woman, as far as we know on science today, that is going to have children. That means you need a permanent affirmative action measure there. So affirmative action measure can't always just be temporary because you're never going to have parity in terms of delivering children, for instance, okay? So you need to think through affirmative action measures theories and you need to put in specific contexts in which it will apply. And the third point I wanted to make, just on Me Too, when you look at and I've seen plenty of comments on this. Me Too has gone too far. There's been a party in Madrid, and I don't mean a party where they had a lot of fun. It was a bunch of angry men, I should say. So party, not in that sense, political party rather, called Vox, which seems to have a masochistic, angry, xenophobic agenda. And the argument was this has gone too far, apparently. When you look at actually what Me Too has achieved, it took a lot of very, very prominent women to be able to stand up to what has been pretty insidious discrimination against them. It's not necessarily filtered down and changed the way in which other women might have been treated. So to think that because a few high-profile cases came to the fore, all workplace harassment has ceased, I think is to fail to understand how power dynamics work.
Can I just add though, also, I think this thing about, oh, well, you know, women give birth, and therefore there'll always be a need to take that into account. Of course, the issue we've got around that is that, yes, women are the ones who give birth, but it's the value we place on that actual role. And if we don't place value on it, then we have to take affirmative action to redress that. And because it seems to be a natural process, all the rest of it, don't place value on that. So the whole issue of value and what we value and how we value it, and the fact we only tend to value those things that we can see in monetary terms, then that's, I think, really getting down to it as well, because it's the value issue that really we need to think about much more on what we do value in society. And as Joshua said, in the hashtag Me Too movement, yeah, it went a long way and on that level to raise awareness, but if you look at the hashtag everyday sexism, that hasn't gone away and that still continues. And I think that's much more where we need to be looking at all those everyday events that occur for women, thousands, millions of women across the globe every day when they walk down the street or they're in the commute to work. And just as they get to a group of men having to like steel themselves before they get there and wonder what's going to be said, or when they get on a tube or a bus worrying about who's going to be on there, or when they get off and it's slightly dark thinking, oh, well, you know, should I be doing that, or going out, what they're wearing, you know, having to think about that when they shouldn't have to. They should be able to walk down the street and wear what they want and not be harassed. But we're nowhere near that level yet.
Thank you. Sorry, I can hear my voice again. Wow, there's a real strong echo for some reason. So I'm just gonna Can you still hear me?
Sound okay to us?
To us, yeah, because we tried earlier as well. We did a test and we sound. You come across perfectly well to us, but maybe other people need to write in if they are having similar problems.
No worries. So thank you so much for explaining that, Sarah, and putting it so well. One aspect where you said that there was a reason, there were terms, as Joshua said, and you said there are terms which are described as what are very visible forms of actions that could be taken, and then there's unpaid work, there's motherhood, there's giving birth, for example, which is something that's just considered to be natural and therefore not something that needs to be quantitative. Like, it's not being understood in the context because mainly possibly a man didn't have to deal with this before. And in that context, our leadership regimes, which were normally typically male dominated, of course, reflected that. And the language of law also reflected that. The one thing that I find very heartening today is that we have a record number of women in positions of leadership. And while they're rising possibly in the positions of national leadership, what we've noted in a couple of plenty of other developer countries, even at local levels of leadership, whether it's city levels or municipal levels, there are more and more women who are now being elected to power. Do you see this as a wave in which perhaps some essential policies and more gendered perspectives will come into the mainstream? Or do you, the one probably fear, the caveat that people say is that perhaps sometimes when a woman is elected, she faces a lot of pressure as well, that she shouldn't always just be the woman voice, and she needs to sort of, take into account the larger community. And therefore, sometimes, for example, in the case of judges, sometimes decisions go against women just because there's a woman judge. I mean, I'm just wondering that, do we ride this tide with a lot of optimism and hope that there will be change in the long run? Or do you think that because of social structures and mores, it's not just enough to have women in leadership? That's the crux of my question.
It's absolutely not enough to have a woman or any woman in leadership, because the assumption then is a woman in leadership, the only reason that all she's thinking about is her gender, and she's thinking herself as a woman and nothing else. We all have different characteristics that play out, particularly when we have positions of power. And it's not just because I happen to be a woman, that doesn't mean that I'm there to promote women's causes or I'm there to promote gender equality, because that's not A, what she might have been elected on, and B, if she's not, just because she's a woman doesn't make her a feminist. And some people actually get by in politics through patriarchal societies, through the very patriarchal power relations that allow them to rise. So they're not going to challenge patriarchy because the patriarchal relationships have allowed them to get to the positions of power. Because, of course, patriarchy is not just relations between women and men or men and women. It's men and men, and it's women and women. And particularly older women with younger women. And the traditional one is the idea that everyone can normally grasp is the mother-in-law having very much power over the young daughter-in-laws, particularly if they have to move into that household. So, and that's not necessarily, a solidarity position that you find yourself in there. So we've got to look at it within patriarchal societies that they have these power relationships at all levels, and it's between women and women as well as women and men. And just by a woman taking on power does not mean that she becomes a feminist and she becomes promoting of women's rights. I always say to my students, look at Margaret Thatcher. She was in power, but no one suggests she was a feminist, and no one suggests that actually the position of women got better under Margaret Thatcher. There are, of course, other women leaders that are very much trying to promote women's rights, or are just doing that. The case of New Zealand comes to mind, just through being themselves. And the whole idea of giving birth while in power. And my partner will look after the child, but I will take the child with me when I travel, and I'll have to breast pump milk, or I might have to breastfeed. So normalizing those issues through their everyday work, and in this case might be high profile, I think is what also brings change, much more than someone going in and say, hey, I'm a woman in power. Great. But I think, as you said, at a local level, there's some studies that suggest that actually what's most important for other women is not seeing someone in a prime minister situation necessarily, but seeing local leaders that they can look to and think, I could achieve that, I could be like that, and then actually thinking about entering politics themselves. And I think that local level is really important for that, for feeling you have a role model. And I think prime ministers are not necessarily role models, but local level politicians who work hard for the community regardless of what sex they are. I think they are important in terms of change.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with all of that, I think, Sarah. And the key, you ask, can we be optimistic? I think in the sense we have to be optimistic about it, but we have to be vigilant. So just because the numbers are coming through, just because there are greater numbers, that's a good thing. So the reverse, if there were poor numbers, would be a bad thing. There are greater numbers coming through, that's a good thing. But we need to now keep focusing on who, what context. And I think that's important, because otherwise, if we don't, there might be more women in parliament, but if they all vote on party lines based on party agendas, it's made no difference whatsoever. Maybe the picture looks more diverse, and this often happens, that diversity becomes a tick box exercise where you want everybody to look different, not necessarily behave different, or not necessarily benefit from what mindsets they have that might improve the quality of the decision-making process. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. We have to hold and not hold the women themselves account. We need to hold the systems to account to make sure that actually we're getting a more diverse vision of policy making. And I absolutely endorse what Sarah is saying in terms of you need women at different levels of politics. I would add you need women in leadership positions in different sectors too. We need to break the hegemony by which you think, oh, well, that's construction, it's going to be a man at the head. Oh, well, that's mining, that's going to be a man. Oh, well, that's football, it's going to be a man. And there's too many sectors there that it looks like, and these are sectors where it's probably uncomfortable to be a woman at any level in that sector. So if you can break through as a woman into a leadership position in those sectors, it has an enormous salience value. It can probably change the way in which these sectors behave. And that can make a massive, massive change, because again, the private sector is not something we should take our minds off.
I think what's interesting on that, if I could just comment on that as well, is when we talk about construction sites or extractive industries, we think of them being strongly patriarchal, strongly sexist. The typical idea of a builder, sexist man making comments as we walk down the street, very exclusionary to women not being involved. But what's quite interesting is if not industries, some other sectors are also highly patriarchal, but we don't think about them in the same way, the legal profession being one of them.
Yeah.
But I think the legal profession more, research suggests, because it's a very elite club still, and it's that idea we have in our minds also where we think these sites of strong patriarchy are, but we've got to bear in mind that they're actually everywhere, and it's not, and often people think, well, it's being uneducated that does it, but sometimes it's being highly educated that can construct them as highly patriarchal sites as well. So we've got to keep that in mind also.
But interestingly, in the legal profession, I mean, and I've done work in different societies here in different contexts, and I can't think of a single country I have participated in very recently, and I'm including the Middle East here, where women don't outnumber men as law students. So you're seeing changes there, and I think those changes have begun to filter in the legal profession. Absolutely, at the top, there is a major, major problem. Here in Britain, for instance, the only female Supreme Court judge happens to be the president, and she's very, very good, Lady Hale. She's the only one. And it's a major problem in a society like this, with a whole history of the fight for equal suffrage, the fight for gender-based rights, all of that. So that absolutely it's true. But I think when you consider construction, the sector, or finance, or some of these sectors, the conversations haven't even begun. You're still getting kids going to school. You're still getting classes that are largely male dominated. So if that's still happening, the supply chain, in a sense, into those sectors has not even changed. In law, I think the supply chain is changing. What you have are different levels at which the change is happening. So.
Two things just come to mind there. I did the summer school of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America. And I was one of, I think it was 16 top-level economists sitting around the table. And the audience, as you said, the people there, the participants, were equal male-female numbers. And around the table, out of 16 of us, how many were women? One, me. And what was I there to talk about? Gender. Yeah. And it was just like, and I raised the question to the participants, well, do you expect that now we would have equal numbers around this table? And then we had the conversation about why not. That might not occur. And then if we did have equal numbers, that'd be great. But on the other thing, the construction site, it just came to mind. There was a campaign on Twitter about a month or so ago where a little girl had come back from school and said to her mum, well, I've always wanted to be a firefighter, but I've changed my mind now because only boys can be firefighters. There's no female firefighters. So her mum went on Twitter and said, can someone please send photos? And there was this outpour of people with hashtag female firefighter sending photos, and it ended up being this was in the UK, and it ended up people in Australia, New Zealand, the United States sending photos to say, yes, I'm a woman and I'm a firefighter. So I think those things can change. I think it's very interesting now how things can change. And we're back to the role models. Back to the idea of people thinking they can do something, and that's the start.
I know, that's so important. I just realized how important it is that we recognize that we need good role models. And in that context, we have James Castillo. I hope he shares your surname, Joshua.
Castillo. Castillo is actually a castle, whereas Castellino is a small castle. So I have to bow down to James Castillo.
Castillo, yeah. So initially, I mean, I read his surname and I was about to say, oh, this is someone I should mention the full name, and then I realized, okay, this is Castillo. As I read it out, I realized, okay, that's wrong. So, but he's a person who's from the Philippines but currently living in Los Angeles, and he's very concerned about looking at the urban poor and urban issues. And he specifically speaks, and I think the question is more directed to you, Sarah, in terms of when you spoke of role models, when you speak about people in your local areas, community, he's asking, how do we empower urban poor women to rise into that space? Like, do you have, maybe if you could share some examples in your vast extensive fieldwork where you've seen that change happen at a thing? Does it require big steps, small steps, dedicated actors or voices, or how do we sort of push towards that empowerment where you see people who come into the economic context of poor, but we see them in that position of leadership?
I think it's an interesting question. Thank you for that, James. I think that the notion of urban is really quite important, because I think in rural areas often you can, because of the community spirit, then you can rise out of that through networks, etc., etc. But often in urban areas, when people have moved there, they don't know people so well, and it can become quite difficult. There's also, I think, possibly, well, in rural and urban areas, there is a cost involved in being able to become active. It's not free. There's money that you have to spend. There's opportunity cost of lost wages. There's cost of actually traveling to meetings, for example, and particularly in urban areas, if you have to get transport and on a bus rather than walking, etc., because they tend to be meetings that might be areas where you've got to go with public transport, for example. So there's a cost involved. So I think urban poverty, when we're looking at that context, it is quite a specific context. In my experience, often what happens is there's something that ignites, there's something that forces people to act. It's not that they are sitting there quietly and one day you think, oh, you know what, I'm going to get involved. There's an issue, there's a local issue that they decide, well, I have to move, I have to respond to this. And this tends to be what ignites people to actually get involved and get moving on that. Of course, you have NGOs coming from the outside, looking to empower people, which of course is great, but on the other hand, it depends how you do it, because it's all about making sure that it comes from the grassroots up, not the NGO flying in and saying, oh, look, we've found all these people and we've given them voice, because that's not true voice. So it's the idea of consciousness raising. And if we look at feminist groups, what they tend to do is around consciousness raising, getting people in groups where they're talking about the issues that affect them, about how their collective issues, about how working collectively could work. So there's that for me is very much what needs to be done. But on the role model issue, often what we find then is people say, well, there's no role model in my local community, or there's no one that I can look up to. And so one of the ideas behind Puntos de Encuentros TV program and other campaigns that other people have put in place is the idea through TV programs or radio programs providing role models. So if there's no one in your local community, but on the TV you see people getting together or responding as young people, and then you can identify with them and see them as role models also. So even if there's not a role model in the local community, I think again the power of media can help people see that someone just like them can act. And that's important.
Just to make James aware, James is a great, not a competitor to our MOOC, but another MOOC run by the SDG Academy on sustainable cities. And as knowing, I have a small part in that one, but knowing the people involved, like Arama, Revi, and Cynthia, and some of the others, that there would be a strong component there on gender, and I'd strongly encourage you to consider enrolling for that particular MOOC as well.
Thank you for plugging that in, Joshua. That's one of my courses as well. And yeah, and it's actually the same. This is the same week that your chapter, Chandrika's chapter on education and skills, and Gautam Bhan's chapter where he speaks about gender in the city, that comes out here, because it looks at human development in the context of cities. So yes, for those of you who are here and you haven't explored sustainable cities as yet, please do check it out. Sarah, just to get back to something, we actually have Carlotta with us, and she says that she wants to know that she wants to work in the humanitarian field, and she's studying social work, political science, cultural geography. So she seems to be on the right track in terms of what she's studying, but she says, what else can I do if this is what I want to work on? So I was thinking, rather than you telling her this is what you can and you cannot do, it would, your body of work and all the work that you've done looks at field work, a lot of the times where you've written that into some excellent theory, and now your years of academic experience. How did you find yourself in this field, and where do you see this level of sort of humanitarianism and gendered roles within that? If we could just know a little bit about how you got here and what that context is.
Well, I can bore you with how
we see you as a role model. If I haven't made that clear, we see you as a role model, and it would be wonderful if we have people who we see as the role models actually tell us how they got there, rather than us having to hear that secondhand. It's better to hear it in your words.
Okay, well, what I would say is that, and I've said this before, it's how I got here was not in a straight line. So I don't think those people who think that this is what I want to do and that's where I'm going to go and I'm just going to head straight. So I'm sure I know you've gone zigzag, Joshua. And I always say that how I ended up where I am is basically a series of happy accidents and taking the opportunities that came my way. Because my first degree is in economics, and then I moved into politics, and then I moved into geography, and then I went back to social policy, and then I've always been gender, but I was doing development, and I was doing disasters, and so you can see the development, but it's very much about what's going on around me and about what's important at that time to get involved with, and grabbing the opportunities to get involved as well, and not being scared to think, well, okay, this isn't exactly what I do, but it's slightly off from what I do, but actually thinking, well, it's something new, it's something different, I'm going to go and do it. And I would say what's interesting is I did a piece of work recently talking to people working in development, disasters, and humanitarian roles. And I asked them this question. They thought I was just going to ask them about, oh, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? And I began with, tell me how you got here. And they had fascinating stories, and none of them had gone in a straight line to get where they were. And in terms of the humanitarian work, what I'd say is a lot of them said it just so happened their first job working for a non-governmental organisation was in a conflict zone. And then from there, they developed their experience and they developed their skill set. And it was very much, if you're coming from the politics or the social side, it was very much finding yourself in that context and finding your experience as that from being there and finding that you could work there, because it's a very specific mindset and skill set that you need in a humanitarian situation to fly in when other people are fleeing, to stay when other people decide they need to leave. It's a very, very specific skill set and mindset. And I think you need to get involved, volunteer, get working, and decide if that is what is right for you. Because if you're out in the field, it's very much, you've got to be the right person for that job, because it's incredibly dedicated. So great that you want to do it, colleague, but really, I think you need to think about, you're obviously on the right track for the right skills, but it is a matter also of saying, well, this is what I'd like to do, and starting to find your way. And then if an opportunity comes up, take it. And I'm a firm believer of not saying, this is the path I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
I'm very much, let's see what might go there. I'm like, that looks interesting. And that helps you being rounded as well. And I know, Joshua, you've come that way also a bit of that.
Yeah, and I think that in a sense, you have to be open. And I think in today's setup, young people coming through university education don't have the same volume of opportunities for work that even my generation had. So you're going to have to be more innovative. And I think partly it is the state of the world we are in, that you have to create the professions that you're going to run. And I hope there will be professions that are specifically in the humanitarian sector that pay specific attention to issues around gender, minorities, indigenous peoples. But I also hope there won't. I also hope that there'll be non-issues and that we will have achieved parity. So, in a sense, it's hard to know, but you need to have a listening brief. You need to be open to many different ideas. You need to be taking opportunities like this MOOC and many other MOOCs. And I would say read about the world with an open mind and double read the press that you get. Don't just rely on the press that you have, because sometimes these things that are posited as received wisdom are not received wisdom. And I'm not talking just about fake news. Fake news is an issue. But I'm talking about hidden perspectives in real news that give you a vision of a world that simply doesn't exist, except in the minds of a few very privileged, usually male journalists, and their take and their proximity to the vested interests in that society.
But I do think in the humanitarian sector, there are now roles that are very specific gender roles. And they are looking much more seriously at it, so it's a good time to be doing that. But then, again, for example, it's one of those weird ones, isn't it? Because we're talking humanitarian, and then the next group that came to my mind was the armed forces, because they're also
humanitarian in theory.
In some of the work they do is very specific, and they're very interested at the minute around how to incorporate gender and what to do about that. And particularly at the high level, they're taking it very seriously around how to do that. So you might think, well, it's completely the opposite of doing humanitarian work. It would be working with the armed forces.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the armed forces are on the ground, and they really do need gender advice. Yeah. So it's taking, as Josh was saying, it's finding those new openings and finding ways to get experience or just find your way in, which might not be the traditional way in.
No.
Yes, but on that note, Sarah, what was wonderful in this year's, I don't know if Joshua caught it this year, but in this year's Republic Day parade, actually, all 3 battalions of the Indian Armed Forces, there were about 3 out of the 7 major marches were actually led by women in these positions and they weren't just leading the squadrons out of like some sort of tokenism. It was very clear that they were the ones who were the best and therefore leading those. So I think, yes, it is important for us to consider those gendered roles and what are typically not considered to be where women are represented or even have that sort of voice. And I hope that I would like to say that I want to see this in a context of very, very optimistic sort of lights, knowing very well that this is something that we need to be vigilant over. But on the context of what you had said, Joshua, in terms of especially the news that we read and what we see, I don't think there's a time in which that needs to be something we need to be more cognizant of, as India's on the eve of another very, very big election where we know that pretty much everything rides on the outcome of what's going to happen in a couple of years and a couple of months. And you also see how pretty much most major decisions will now be based on affecting that. And this seems to be the global trend, where you're worried about the politics affecting daily lives, and then how daily lives are sort of molded by one sense of what that politics is, because this is what you read and this is what you see. And there's never been a time where that's really glaringly obvious. We have some wonderful comments from a lot of the people in the chat box saying, thank you so much for such wonderful answers. I think you've taken each of these questions and sort of shared them in a context where people are very pleased with those answers. I think my final question for tonight would be that going back to the larger context of what the law sees, who are the people that the law recognizes, and who are the people that are missing in this current regime. Of course, gender being one factor into that. And it's wonderful that in our most recent gender profiles exercise and various other things, we're looking at the voices of all genders and not just looking at women. But going back to the law, Joshua, you mentioned about law students and then people practicing. This is exactly what I had experienced even as I was a law student. In fact, I remember the day that I took admission into my law college, my local guardian asked me, is this a girls' college? Because in the queue that was in the merit section, there were just women who were applying. And it seemed like there were more girls in my class easily. And now when I look back, I've been working as a professional, at least in this sector, for a couple of years. And so most of my friends who are in the legal field, there isn't a single girl who I know who's in practice. So I'm just wondering, I mean, we see this year after year, but I'm just wondering, like, unfortunately, the legal profession has this this opinion about it where it is a very, very sexist court system. And one does not even trust that if a smart, independent, and strong woman is actually in that position of power, she's not being, unfortunately, associated with some man, right? And what disturbs me so much is this is right, of course, right there in law where we routinely have these conversations. But as we talked about, hashtag everyday sexism, there seems to be a perspective of what are professions which are safe for women, professions where women can get to the top without that much, I don't know, trouble or controversy, and those which women are not supposed to be there. So I want to sort of end this talk this very interesting talk about women work and autonomy in this context. That what do you think is going to shape women's choices for work in the future? Like, are we cognizant of this? Are these just invisible structures that continue to pervade and we're just going to be silent about it? What more do we need? I mean, we're having women point fingers at those lawyers, at those judges on a daily basis, but it somehow seems to be a regime that reinforces that sexism. So do we find a way out of this, or is this just going to be something that we acknowledge and hope that the small measures over time make that change?
Yeah, I mean, see, in my worldview on this one, when you look at the origins of law itself, and I think I say this in the actual MOOC, when you look at the origins of law itself, these were, essentially men who were property owners. So the whole trapping of law was always about exclusion. And what were the earliest laws? The earliest laws were protecting property against encroachment. So the entire raison d'etre of law was let's make order. And order meant keeping things as we were. So if I'm a hugely wealthy man in ancient Greece, I get the right to sit in the Athenian democracy, and I get to write laws. Of course, the laws I write are all about maintaining my hegemony. So inevitably, law is a super, super, super conservative discipline, very, very patriarchal in its setup, and very, very patriarchal even in its aims. Because even that order was all about maintaining property. Women couldn't own property, slaves couldn't own property. So this was at the very origin of the law, the project of law was this idea. Even if you get more, ask questions about justice, they say, yes, it's order and justice, and order comes first and then justice follows. And even justice is not necessarily gender justice. It's justice about fair trial, process. So the profession itself is steep. And probably the bedrock of it is patriarchy. So the question then becomes, how do you change it? And sure, you can do the critique of it, and you're absolutely right. But unless you start making meaningful changes within that particular profession, you're not going to get anywhere. That's my view. And I think, in a sense, what is happening now is you're just getting, in many jurisdictions, queues and queues of qualified women who are more qualified and better qualified than other people. The first 10 are being turned around, are being dismissed just based on mindset and discriminatory mindsets, and there's 10 more that will come. And there's 10 more that will come. And there's 10 more that will come. So it's a bit of an attrition game, but that attrition game is just to get in. It's not to change the system. That's just to get in. There's still another task altogether to change the system. I was in Cote d'Ivoire last week looking at trying to agree principles. They're called the Abidjan principles. They'll be released soon, looking to regulate private actors in the field of education. And we had similar types of questions there. Well, are we really worrying about minority access? And I said the same thing. Minority access means allowing or facilitating minorities to come and watch your game. It's not allowing them to play. It's not allowing them to change it. And I think that's the same aspect with women in the law, that now we're getting to the stage where there's greater participation. That still is not changing the setup. The change will come when there's clear understanding and determination to change the fact that women don't have equal access to the factors of production. Women don't have equal access to finance. Women don't have equal access to land. Women don't have equal access to nationality. Three very, very key elements there. And law is the one that set up the regimes that prevent it. So you've got to start by, first of all, eliminating those regimes, smashing the patriarchy, as Sarah might say, on those ones. And even then, that's just a drop in the ocean. But the content discussion hasn't started yet. What has started, and to see, and when you talk about the queues of girls going to college, what has started is the access question. And that's good, because we don't get that kind of volume. If you only have one woman and she goes for a job, and there's a masochistic person there who dismisses her, well, the next 9 candidates are going to be men. So he is going to get to pick from among those 9 men, and he's going to say the woman wasn't good enough. If, on the other hand, there are 10 women in that list, you dismiss the first, there's the second. You dismiss the second, there's a third. So the volume game, there's a lot to say for. But that still is only access. That's not content. The content question, that's a much bigger question. And I don't think the two are linked. But clearly, the more access you have, the more likely you are to start getting to the content question.
I think, can I just say that I think on an everyday basis within the profession, I don't work within the profession, but I have friends, and I was at an event in January, which had lots of people high up in law firms there, and lots of women who are quite high up in law firms as partners. And one of the things they were talking about was how they are trying to look after the women coming through the profession now and taking affirmative action quietly, not publicly, not formally, but very much making sure that the younger women coming through have the opportunities, making sure that if they seem to be discriminated against by someone else in the practice, that they push forward, trying to make sure when they go on maternity leave, the younger women, that when they come back, that's not seen as a negative thing. They're not behind because of having done that. And these are informal actions. And it's about role models. It's about people, if they've achieved power, then they use it in order not to put the drawbridge, but actually to try and facilitate other people coming and joining them and increasing the number and quietly trying to change the practice, trying to change day-to-day behaviour, because gendered relations are how we construct them on a day-to-day basis. Yes, we have the formal patriarchal structures, but on a day-to-day basis, we can work differently and we can gradually start to try and change that as well. And I think that is going on in most professions. And I think that's a very positive day-to-day thing all of us can do.
You just think about that, right? You just think about that example that Sarah gave. Now, that is a gendered perspective of maybe, but actually, you know what? Male professionals in that field didn't help each other out. It was a dog-eat-dog world. That was part of the problem. So I think this is where you see the change already in terms of an attitude and a mentality, and it's actually going to result in more women doing well, but it's going to change the profession and take it away from being a dog-eat-dog world. I will work 12 hours, you work 12 hours, I see your 12 hours, I do 14 hours, and there's that kind of a mentality there that has characterized legal practice, which automatically creates barriers, formal and informal, towards women participation. Whereas something like this will change it. It'll change it for everybody, including the men who do it. Because it doesn't have to be that kind of a competitive, I will use my elbows to smash all the opposition, so I'm the only one left. And I think that's the kind of quality and the qualitative and the quantitative side of it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Actually, on a final note, because you all touched upon justice, and we looked at gender justice as well as social justice and what that would mean. I would like to remind our viewers and the people who are taking the course with us that the 20th of February is the World Day of Social Justice. And we at the SDG Academy, for those who are members of our alumni group, we're doing a little feature where we want you to talk about social justice. And what I learned very interestingly that it was something that was brought forth by the International Labour Organization. And the day was to commemorate workers' rights and looking at social justice in the context of what needs to be a peace agenda of some sort. And my view of this is very, very topical. So I would love for you, Joshua, just to give a little bit of your context and knowledge to this day and why it's commemorated. And on that note, we will, of course, end just keeping that that the fact that there's something like this there.
Look, this is the 100th anniversary of the creation of the International Labour Organization. It was set up in 1919 very much to try and ensure that workers all across the world had rights. It's a fascinating organization. It pays quite a lot of attention to trade union rights. And it's paid quite a lot of attention not just to access questions, but also to decent work questions. But even the International Labour Organization, when it was formed in 1919, took a very, very strong view of what labor was. It didn't include women in the way in which it looked at labor. But then it's changing. The organization is changing. But one of the big quests at the moment also for the International Labour Organization is, what does it mean to be in work? You now have increasingly what we refer to in some parts of the West as a gig economy, where you have no certainty as to whether or not you'll get a check the next day. There are question marks around 0-hour contracts, where essentially I as an employer reserve the right to call upon you, but I don't have to give you any money for being able to call upon you. You as a vulnerable worker desperately need me to call upon you, so you're willing to take the work, even unpaid, so you can get professional, you can get brownie points to put on your CV. The world of work is a mess. It's an absolute world of it's an absolute mess. Social justice is a key element to this, because the biggest challenge going forward in the climate changed world that we see, the next biggest challenge is mechanization and the extent to which we can create meaningful work in the public space for all and recognize work that takes place outside the public space as work. So I think these are major challenges, and it's really poignant that the Social Justice Day was actually coined by the International Labour Organization. It has a troubled history on some of the issues that we've been looking at. I mean, 1957, it passed a standard that essentially treated indigenous peoples as in need of patriarchy and protection and patronage. Of course, this standard has changed. It's now 1989, which is far better. But it's a call to action, I think. Understanding what creative work means, understanding how to value it, understanding how to gain access to it for everybody. These are major challenges in the 21st century.
I think the ILO is interesting because it has evolved. And it is one of those institutions that does try and move forward, gets it wrong sometimes, but as you say, does try and move forward and work with what is going on at the moment, which is truly important.
Those who are interested in labor issues, my favorite photographer, Sebastian Salgado. If you just Google Sebastian Salgado,
he's phenomenal. Yeah,
you see some incredible photographs of people at work all over the world. A Brazilian photographer. It's his photograph is actually my my Twitter handle. So you might find, if you can't find Sebastian Salgado and World of Work, you might have to find my Twitter account.
Okay. Anyways, thank you so much, Joshua and Sarah. Thank you for joining us at this third webinar. A special note to all the people who joined us, please tell your friends and colleagues who are with us in this course to please fill up the gender profiles exercise. That's a very interesting little exercise that we have for you, which we will discuss in one of the future webinars. But we definitely need a good enough sample size, so we need you to fill that. Please fill up your gut instinct, your first question. It will really not take you more than 10 to 15 minutes to do it. And we hope you fill that up so that we can have a more engaged and like strong discussion on these very topics that we touched upon today. Thank you so much for joining us again, and thank you to all of you who've tuned in. Thank you for such wonderful questions and being with us through the evening. We will see you next Monday. Until then, goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.